Ladies and gentlemen, if you enjoy my video, please click the like button and share the video. It is the only way the YouTube algorithms really notices me. I will be very grateful to you. The Graveyard Shift That Didn't End. Scary story published by Scare Fiction. Read for you by Scare Fiction. Chapter 1. First Night on the Job. The clock struck midnight as I stepped through the rusted iron gates of Rosewood Cemetery. The full moon cast an eerie glow over the sprawling graveyard, illuminating the old, crumbling tombstones that stretched as far as the eye could see. A cold fog rolled in, wrapping around the graves like ghostly fingers, and the damp, earthy scent of freshly turned soil filled the air. This was my first night as the cemetery's night watchman, a job I had reluctantly taken to escape the suffocating grief that haunted me. I walked past the weathered statues of angels and saints, their stone faces worn and somber. My flashlight beam danced over names and dates long forgotten, each one telling a silent story of life and death. At the edge of the cemetery, an old, decrepit house loomed, its windows dark and foreboding. This was the caretaker's residence, where Mr. Thompson lived. As I approached, the door creaked open and the man himself stepped out. He was tall and gaunt, with a shock of white hair and eyes that seemed to hold the weight of countless secrets. "Evening, Jake," Mr. Thompson greeted, his voice gravelly. "Welcome to Rosewood." "Thanks," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "Anything I should know before I start?" Mr. Thompson gave a slow, knowing nod. "This place has its quirks. Shadows where there shouldn't be any. Cold spots even on the warmest nights. And sometimes whispers that seem to come from nowhere." I chuckled nervously. "Sounds like you're trying to scare me off on my first night." "Just be careful, kid," he said, his tone suddenly serious. "Some things here are best left undisturbed." With that, he turned and disappeared into the house, leaving me alone in the cold night. I began my rounds, my footsteps echoing in the stillness. The cemetery seemed to come alive in the darkness. Shadows flickered at the edges of my vision, and I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. The wind whispered through the trees, carrying with it faint, indistinguishable voices. I shrugged off the unease, reminding myself that it was just my imagination playing tricks. As the night wore on, my flashlight flickered, casting long, distorted shadows. I stumbled upon an overgrown path that led to a secluded corner of the graveyard. There, hidden beneath a tangle of vines, was an old, forgotten grave. The headstone was cracked and weathered, but the name carved into the stone sent a shiver down my spine. Sarah Miller. I knew that name. But from where? Before I could piece it together, a cold wind swept through the cemetery, and the distant sound of a mournful wail echoed through the night. My heart pounded in my chest as I hurried back to the caretaker's house, the unsettling feeling that I was being watched gnawing at me. The graveyard shift had only just begun, and already I was beginning to realize that some secrets should remain buried. Chapter 2. Unraveling the Past. Cold wind still lingered as I made my way back to the caretaker's house. My mind raced with thoughts of Sarah Miller and the strange events of the night. Why did her name seem so familiar? I needed answers, and I knew the only place to start was the caretaker's shed, where Mr. Thompson kept the old records. The shed was a rickety structure, leaning slightly to one side. Inside, it smelled of mildew and old paper. I flicked on my flashlight and began sifting through stacks of dusty files and forgotten artifacts. After what felt like hours, I stumbled upon a worn, leather-bound book. The label on its spine read Rosewood Cemetery Records. Flipping through the fragile pages, I found Sarah Miller's entry. She had died in 1923 under mysterious circumstances. The record was brief, but but mentioned a series of strange events leading up to her death. Her grave had been undisturbed for decades, but there were no details about her life or the exact cause of her death. My curiosity deepened, and a sense of unease settled over me. As I left the shed, a chill ran down my spine. The cemetery seemed different now, more alive, more aware of my presence. I could feel eyes on me, but every time I turned, there was nothing but the shadows cast by the flickering street lamps. Walking back to Sarah's grave, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Fresh flowers lay at the base of her tombstone, their petals bright and unwilted despite the chill of the night. No one had visited the graveyard since I started my shift. My flashlight beam wavered as I stepped closer, my breath visible in the cold air. Suddenly, I heard the crunch of footsteps behind me. I spun around, my heart pounding, but saw nothing. The shadows seemed to shift and dance just beyond the light's reach. I took a deep breath and forced myself to stay calm. It had to be my imagination. The next evening, I found Mr. Thompson as he was finishing his rounds. "Mr. Thompson," I called out, trying to keep my voice steady, "I need to ask you about Sarah Miller." He paused, his expression unreadable. "What about her?" "I found her grave," I said, "and I've been experiencing strange things. Fresh flowers on her grave, footsteps, whispers." Mr. Thompson's eyes darkened. "Sarah Miller," he began slowly, "was a troubled soul. Her death was not natural, and this place has never been the same since. Some say her spirit still lingers, unable to find peace." "What happened to her?" I pressed. Mr. Thompson shook his head. "Best you don't dig too deep, Jake. Some stories are better left buried." His words only fueled my determination. There was more to Sarah's story, and I was going to uncover the truth, no matter the cost. The atmosphere thickened with each passing night, and the line between the living and the dead blurred further. The more I uncovered, the more I felt the graveyard's grip tightening around me, pulling me deeper into its dark history. Chapter 3: The Caretaker's Secrets. The more nights I spent at Rosewood Cemetery, the more the place seemed to come alive with its own dark energy. The shadows felt thicker, the whispers more insistent. Yet, it wasn't just the graveyard that was unsettling me. Mr. Thompson's behavior grew increasingly strange, and I couldn't shake the feeling that he knew more about Sarah Miller than he was willing to admit. One night, as I made my rounds, I saw Mr. Thompson by Sarah's grave, whispering something under his breath. He quickly turned away when he saw me, but not before I caught the look of fear in his eyes. It wasn't just the usual unease. It was something deeper, something haunted. Curiosity gnawed at me, and I decided to explore the caretaker's house when Mr. Thompson wasn't around. I found a small, dusty office filled with old papers and letters. Among the clutter, a stack of yellowed letters tied with a ribbon caught my eye. They were addressed to Mr. Thompson from someone named Emily. I sat down and began to read. The letters revealed a long, twisted history between Mr. Thompson and Sarah Miller. Emily wrote about their childhood, how Mr. Thompson had always been close to Sarah, and how their relationship grew complicated over the years. One letter, in particular, stood out. Emily wrote about the night Sarah died, hinting at a dark secret that Mr. Thompson had been keeping all these years. The letter read, "I know you feel responsible for what happened to Sarah. The whispers in the night, the flowers on her grave, these are her ways of trying to reach out. But you must let her go, George. You must find a way to set her spirit free." I heard the front door creak open and quickly hid the letters. Mr. Thompson walked in, his eyes narrowing as he saw me. "What are you doing in here?" he demanded. "I need answers," I said, holding up the letter. "What really happened to Sarah?" Mr. Thompson's face paled. "You don't understand, Jake. This isn't something you should be meddling with. Tell me the truth, or I'll find it myself, I insisted. He sighed, defeated. Sarah's death was a tragedy, yes, but it wasn't an accident. She was sacrificed. There's a curse on this place, and it's tied to her spirit. Sacrificed? By whom? Mr. Thompson looked away. It's a long story, one that puts you in danger the more you know. You need to stop digging for your own safety. But I couldn't stop. I had to know the truth. The connection I felt to Sarah's story was too strong, too personal. I wasn't just uncovering the graveyard's dark history. I was unraveling something that had been buried deep within myself. As Mr. Thompson left the room, his warning echoed in my mind. The danger was real, but so was the need for answers. I was in too deep to turn back now. The secrets of Rosewood Cemetery were calling to me, and I was determined to uncover every last one. Chapter 4: Descent into Madness. Mr. Thompson's warning weighed heavily on my mind as I returned to my rounds. The graveyard, once just a place of work, now felt like a living, breathing entity watching my every move. My sleep grew increasingly restless, filled with vivid nightmares that left me gasping for breath. Night after night, the line between reality and hallucination blurred, and the graveyard's grip on my mind tightened. One night, I awoke in a cold sweat, the remnants of a nightmare clinging to me. In the dream, I had seen Sarah, her ghostly figure standing at the foot of my bed, her eyes filled with sorrow and a plea for help. I shook my head, trying to dispel the lingering fear, but the images were etched into my mind. At work, the supernatural occurrences grew more aggressive. Shadows moved with intent, whispering my name in voices that seemed to come from all directions. I saw fleeting apparitions of Sarah in the corner of my vision, only to vanish when I turned to look. Cold spots became icy patches that chilled me to the bone, and the feeling of being watched was ever present. One particularly harrowing night, as I patrolled near Sarah's grave, I felt a sudden, sharp pain in my back. I stumbled, dropping my flashlight, and fell to my knees. When I turned, there was nothing there, but the pain remained, burning and relentless. Trembling, I retrieved my flashlight and continued, the fear gnawing at my sanity. The nights stretched on, each one more torturous than the last. I started seeing things that couldn't be real faces in the windows of the caretaker's house. Disembodied hands, reaching out from the graves. I questioned my sanity, wondering if the job was driving me mad or something more sinister was at play. Flashbacks of my past began to haunt me during these sleepless nights. I remembered the accident that had claimed my wife, the guilt that had driven me to this lonely job. Her face, her voice echoed in my mind, blending with Sarah's tragic story. Parallels were too strong to ignore, and I began to feel an inexplicable connection to Sarah, as if our fates were intertwined. Isolated and paranoid, I started to withdraw from Mr. Thompson and anyone who might offer help. The only thing that felt real was the graveyard and its relentless grip on my psyche. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, and the apparitions more frequent. I could no longer tell where the nightmares ended and reality began. One night, as I stood by Sarah's grave, exhausted and desperate, I heard a voice, clear and sorrowful. "Help me, Jake." It was Sarah, her ghostly form appearing before me, more real than ever. Her eyes bored into mine, filled with a desperate plea for release. My heart raced, and I fell to my knees. "What do you want from me?" I cried out. "Set me free," she whispered, her voice fading with the wind. As the night swallowed her form, I knew I was on the brink of madness. The graveyard held too many secrets, and its darkness was pulling me deeper into an abyss from which there might be no return. Chapter 5: Discovering the Truth. Terror of Sarah's plea haunted me, driving me to the edge of my sanity. Determined to uncover the truth, I returned to the caretaker's house, hoping to find answers buried in the past. The old wooden floors creaked beneath my feet as I searched every corner, every dusty shelf. My flashlight flickered, casting long shadows that seemed to watch my every move. In the back of a forgotten closet, I discovered a hidden compartment. My heart raced as I pried it open, revealing a stack of old documents tied with brittle twine. These papers were different from the cemetery records. They were personal letters, journals, and ancient manuscripts. I spread them out on the table, the weight of their secrets pressing down on me. The documents told a story of horror and tragedy. Long ago, a ritual had been performed in Rosewood Cemetery to bind the spirits of the dead, ensuring they could never leave. It was believed to keep the living safe from the vengeful dead, but the price was the eternal suffering of those spirits. Among them was Sarah Miller, who had been sacrificed to seal the ritual. My breath caught in my throat as I read her name, understanding now the depth of her torment. As I pieced together the graveyard's dark history, the atmosphere around me grew heavier. The air became thick with an oppressive energy, and I could feel the spirits closing in. The lights flickered, and a cold draft swept through the room, scattering the papers. The temperature dropped sharply, and I heard the familiar, mournful whisper of Sarah's voice. The spirits were becoming more aggressive, no longer content with mere whispers and shadows. Objects in the room began to move of their own accord. Books flew off shelves, and a picture frame shattered against the wall. I felt an icy grip on my shoulder, spinning around to face nothing but empty air. My heart pounded as I realized I was no longer just an observer, I was their target. The physical attacks intensified. Sharp pains jabbed at my sides, invisible hands yanked at my hair, and unseen forces shoved me to the ground. Blood pounded in my ears as I fought to stay conscious. The poltergeist activity grew more violent with each passing moment. The spirits were desperate, and so was I. Amidst the chaos, I found a final, crucial document, a ritual to counter the curse and free the trapped spirits. The instructions were detailed, involving specific incantations, symbols, and a personal sacrifice. It was a dangerous and uncertain path, but it was the only way to end the torment. Determined to break the curse and set Sarah and the others free, I gathered the necessary items and headed towards the heart of the graveyard. The spirit's fury followed me, the cold wind howling through the trees as I prepared for the ritual. My hands trembled as I traced the ancient symbols on the ground, chanting the incantations written in the old manuscript. As I spoke the final words, the ground beneath me shook violently. The spirits screamed in rage and pain, their forms swirling around me in a vortex of ghostly energy. I could feel their anguish, their desperate longing for release. Summoning every ounce of strength, I made the required sacrifice, feeling a part of myself being ripped away. The night exploded in a blinding light, and then silence. The oppressive weight lifted, and the graveyard fell still. The spirits were gone, their whispers silenced, their suffering ended. I collapsed to the ground, exhausted and battered, but filled with a profound sense of relief. Sarah's voice was the last to fade, a soft, grateful whisper in the wind. "Thank you, Jake." As dawn broke over Rosewood Cemetery, I knew that while the spirits were finally at peace, the experience had changed me forever. The graveyard's dark secrets had been uncovered, and I had survived the night. But the memory of that terror would haunt me always, a reminder of the thin veil between the living and the dead. Chapter 6. The Ritual. The dawn's light offered a fleeting sense of calm, but I knew it wouldn't last. The spirit's rage had only been temporarily quelled. The counter-ritual was my only hope to free them, and end the curse that bound Rosewood Cemetery. Exhausted but resolute, I delved into the hidden documents in old books, piecing together the steps of the ancient ritual. Days turned into sleepless nights as I studied the cryptic texts. The attacks from the spirits grew more ferocious, their desperation palpable. Objects hurled themselves at me. Doors slammed shut on their own, and the whispers escalated into a cacophony of mournful wails. Each night was a battle for survival, but I pressed on, driven by the need to end this nightmare. The night of the ritual arrived. I gathered the items listed in the ancient manuscript: candles, chalk, a silver dagger, and a vial of my own blood. As I stepped out into the graveyard, the air was thick with an ominous presence. The ground seemed to hum with anticipation, the tombstones casting long, foreboding shadows under the pale moonlight. I traced the symbols on the ground, my hands shaking as I chanted the incantations. The atmosphere grew electric, and the spirit's fury erupted around me. The earth trembled, tombstones cracked, and spectral figures emerged from the darkness, their faces twisted in agony. Suddenly, Mr. Thompson appeared, his face pale and eyes wide with fear. "Jake, stop!" he shouted, his voice barely audible over the supernatural chaos. "You don't understand what you're doing." I continued the ritual, the ground shaking violently beneath me. "I have to finish this," I yelled back, my voice strained with determination. Mr. Thompson rushed towards me, grabbing my arm. "You're making a mistake. The ritual requires a true sacrifice, one that can bind you to this place forever if done incorrectly."
His words sent a chill down my spine.
"What do you mean?" "This cemetery is cursed because of a flawed ritual. To break it, you must sacrifice something precious, willingly. If you're not careful, you'll be trapped here, just like the spirits." The ground split open near Sarah's grave, a vortex of spectral energy swirling around us. I looked into Mr. Thompson's eyes, seeing the desperation and sincerity. "Then help me," I pleaded. "Tell me what to do." Mr. Thompson nodded, his grip tightening on my arm. "You must give up the source of your own pain, the thing that ties you to this place." I realized then what he meant. My grief, my guilt over my wife's death, had drawn me to this graveyard, binding me to its sorrow. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the locket that held her picture, the last physical connection I had to her. With trembling hands, I placed the locket at the center of the ritual circle. "I'm sorry," I whispered, tears streaming down my face. "I have to let you go." As I chanted the final incantation, the locket glowed with a soft, ethereal light. The ground stopped shaking, and the spectral figures paused, their anguished expressions softening. The vortex of energy absorbed the locket, and a blinding light enveloped the graveyard. When the light faded, the spirits were gone. The air was still, and an overwhelming sense of peace settled over Rosewood Cemetery. I collapsed to the ground, exhausted but relieved. Mr. Thompson helped me to my feet, his eyes filled with gratitude. "You did it, Jake," he said softly. "You freed them." As dawn broke once more, I knew I had not only freed the spirits, but also myself. The graveyard's dark history was finally laid to rest, and with it, the heavy burden of my own past. Chapter 7: Confrontation and Sacrifice. The brief calm that had settled over Rosewood Cemetery was shattered as night fell. The graveyard, though momentarily quiet, held a tense anticipation in the air. Mr. Thompson and I prepared for the final confrontation, knowing that the spirit's malevolence would soon erupt once more. Armed with the knowledge from the ancient manuscripts and a newfound determination, we faced the inevitable storm. The cemetery transformed into a battleground. Spectral figures emerged from the shadows, their forms twisted with rage and sorrow. The ground trembled, and the wind howled through the trees. Mr. Thompson and I stood our ground, chanting the incantations that we hoped would hold back the onslaught. But the spirits were relentless, their fury intensifying with each passing moment. Amidst the chaos, I saw Sarah's spirit, her face a mask of sorrow and pain. She reached out to me, and I felt a pull, as if our fates were intertwined. I knew then that to complete the ritual and free the spirits, I had to confront my deepest fear and guilt. The past tragedy that had brought me here, the death of my wife, was the key to ending this nightmare. The final piece of the ritual required a personal sacrifice, something deeply connected to my pain. I took a deep breath and stepped towards Sarah's spirit, feeling the weight of my grief and guilt pressing down on me. "Show me," I whispered, my voice barely audible over the din of the restless spirits. Sarah's eyes locked onto mine, and in that moment, I was transported to a memory I had tried so hard to forget. The car accident that had claimed my wife's life played out before me, every detail vivid and excruciating. The guilt I had carried for so long surged within me, nearly overwhelming. Tears streamed down my face as I faced Sarah. "I am so sorry," I choked out, my voice breaking. I couldn't save her. Sarah's spirit reached out, her touch cold but filled with understanding. "You must forgive yourself. Only then can you set us free." With trembling hands, I pulled out the silver dagger, the final component of the ritual. The instructions were clear. I had to make a sacrifice, to give up the part of myself that had been consumed by guilt and pain. I pressed the blade to my palm, feeling the sharp sting as blood flowed, mingling with the ancient symbols on the ground. As I chanted the final words, the ground beneath us glowed with an ethereal light. The spirits screamed in unison, their forms twisting and dissipating into the night. The energy built to a crescendo, and I felt a part of myself being pulled away, the weight of my guilt lifting. In the blinding light, I saw Sarah's spirit one last time. "Thank you," she whispered, her form fading. "You've set us free." The light faded, and the cemetery fell silent. The oppressive weight lifted, replaced by a profound sense of peace. I collapsed to the ground, exhausted and bleeding, but filled with a sense of release. Mr. Thompson knelt beside me, his eyes filled with gratitude and relief. "You did it, Jake," he said softly. "You saved them." As dawn broke over Rosewood Cemetery, I knew that while the spirits were finally at peace, the true battle had been within myself. The graveyard's dark history had been laid to rest, and with it, the heavy burden of my past. I had made the ultimate sacrifice, and in doing so, I had found redemption. Chapter 8: Resolution and Aftermath. The dawn's light broke over Rosewood Cemetery, casting long shadows that seemed to recede into the earth, taking with them the tormented spirits that had plagued this place for so long. The air was still, a profound silence settling over the graveyard. The malevolent energy that once clung to every stone and tree had vanished, replaced by an eerie calm. I sat on the grass, the weight of my exhaustion heavy but tempered with relief. Mr. Thompson stood beside me, his face reflecting a mix of weariness and quiet triumph. "It's over," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I nodded, feeling the truth of his words. The spirits, including Sarah, were finally at peace. The ritual had worked, and the graveyard's dark grip had been broken. But the cost had been high. I had faced my deepest fears and made a sacrifice that left me forever changed. The guilt and sorrow that had driven me to this place had been lifted, but the scars remained. Slowly, I stood, wincing at the pain in my hand where the dagger had cut deep. I looked around the graveyard, now just a quiet resting place for the dead, no longer haunted by restless spirits. The transformation was almost surreal. As I prepared to leave, my eyes fell on the caretaker's house. Drawn by a sense of finality, I walked inside one last time. On the table where I'd spread out the old documents, I found a note addressed to me in Mr. Thompson's shaky handwriting. Jake, there's something you must know. The graveyard's secrets run deeper than you think. Your connection to this place is no coincidence. Years ago, a similar ritual was performed to save another soul. That soul was your great-grandfather. This place has always been tied to your family, and perhaps it always will be. Be vigilant. Though the immediate danger is gone, the graveyard's true nature is not entirely at rest. There are forces at work that neither of us fully understand. Take care. Mr. Thompson. A chill ran down my spine as I read the note. The sense of unease that had plagued me from the beginning returned, a subtle reminder that some mysteries were never truly solved. The connection to my great-grandfather was a revelation that added a new layer of complexity to my understanding of the graveyard. I walked out of the house, the note clutched in my hand. The sun was rising, casting a warm glow over the tombstones. I took a deep breath, feeling a strange mix of relief and lingering dread. The immediate threat was gone, but the graveyard's secrets were far from laid to rest. As I left Rosewood Cemetery behind, I knew I was forever changed. The experiences I had endured, the truths I had uncovered, and the sacrifices I had made would stay with me, a constant reminder of the thin veil between the living and the dead. The graveyard might have been calm for now, but its shadow would always loom in the background of my mind, whispering of the mysteries that still lay buried beneath its soil.